everyone, and thank you for joining Lambert and our family of companies as we welcome Joel Stern, Chief Executive Officer of the National Association of Minority and Women-Owned Law Firms, Inc. My name is Sierra Mangle, and I am the marketing lead here at Lambert. I am so excited today to host this webinar with Joel to really talk about how to tailor and focus your diversity and inclusion efforts for leaders in the corporate space. So before I introduce Jeff and Joel, I want to kick it over to Nia to share a little bit about her background and our new partnership with EQUALSIGN.
Thank you so much, Sierra, and thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Nia Batts, and I'm a founding partner at EQUALSIGN. And EQUALSIGN is a woman of color-owned and led DEI consultancy that's focused on diverse board development for public companies and for private equity firms. We also specialize in ESG consulting, strategic audience engagement, and culture-driven marketing and communications, both within organizations and also external to their stakeholders. I spent a decade in-house at Viacom CBS in New York and Los Angeles, and as the head of strategic partnerships and social innovation, my focus was on the day-to-day operations of 3 cross-divisional task forces that developed marketing, programming, and pro-social campaigns for our key corporate, nonprofit, and talent partners. One of those clients, General Motors, provided me the opportunity to make monthly trips back here to Detroit. And 3 years ago, I felt that there was something happening here in the city that I didn't want to miss being a part of. It was a city and its people and its businesses working to not only strengthen and prosper, but a community of leaders that is really contending with what it means to do so in a racially and socioeconomically diverse and inclusive manner. And we founded EQUALSIGN quietly, almost a year ago, actually, as a diverse group of leaders with expertise in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also experience in driving people-centered development and organizational change. And I think it's the active process of empathy that informs our passion towards allyship and also the responsibility that comes with access and opportunity. And so I'm very grateful and excited to be here with 2 of my allies in this work today.
Awesome. Thank you, Nia. So as many of you know, Lambert is a leading public relations, investor relations, and integrated marketing firm with offices in Grand Rapids, Detroit, Lansing, New York City, Phoenix, and Houston. For more than 20 years, our firm has partnered with clients across the globe to help them achieve their strategic goals. At the age of 26, our CEO, Jeff Lambert, founded the firm in his basement and has led our organization through 22 strong years of growth to become a top 50 PR firm nationally. In addition to the many hats that he wears here at Lambert, he has also founded Ticker, a fintech software startup company that gives publicly traded companies the ability to connect directly with their individual investors. And he is also a co-founder of EQUALSIGN. So again, I am so excited to welcome Joel Stern. He is the Chief Executive Officer at NAMWOLF and has been there since 2014. The organization provides corporations a premier place to go to locate and hire minority and women-owned law firms of the highest caliber. Joel has spent more than 25 years as an in-house counsel for major companies. Previously, he has served as a deputy general counsel for over a decade and has led as a chief operating officer at a number of companies. And in 2020 this year, of course, you guys, Joel has been announced as the lead example award from the National Association of Women-Owned Lawyers. So without further ado, or more stumbling for me, I am happy to present to you Joel Stern.
Thank you. And Sierra, your job just started. You get to turn the slides for me. So you have the job of everybody. And thank you, Jeff and Nia and Sierra, and my best bud, Sarah, who's at Lambert, for brokering this introduction. I'm looking forward to this. And 2 admissions. Number 1, this is my 3rd presentation today. So I think I've had one bathroom break since 9. So if you see me disappear for a second, we'll just say the computer froze, right? And 2 is my audience has historically been law firms and Fortune 500 corporate legal groups. So this is a challenge. So this presentation has been customized, hopefully to fit into the parameters of what a best-in-class corporate D&I program looks like. So I love the fact that I get to do it a little bit differently. Sierra, is the presentation on? There it is, perfect. So it is really the perfect time to talk about this subject. And I have a very simple goal, and you will tell me if I've achieved it. My goal is, if I can get you to do something differently tomorrow in the D&I space than you're doing today, no matter where you are and who you work for, then I will consider that a success. In 1 hour or 45 minutes, I am not going to stand up a D&I program for you. But if I can give you ideas and things to think about, and now you have a resource to reach out to, and you take some of this back and you build it into your department or company, that is a measure of success. And we are now on the next slide. This is a fun slide. This slide has changed 3 times in the last 9 months. In December of 2019, when I was out physically meeting with corporations and legal groups, this slide was titled, "Diversity Fatigue, Don't Let It Happen." And the reason it was titled Diversity Fatigue is because I was sensing or being told clearly that people are tired of talking about this subject. We have seen so many calls to action in the legal profession and in other areas of the corporate world where it's all talk and no action. And the cynicism that's out there is healthy, because hopefully it will drive us not to do the wrong things again. But it not only comes from minorities and women, but it comes from majority males as well. They're tired. You know, Albert Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And that's what we in corporate America have been doing with respect to diversity and inclusion. So I went out proselytizing to corporations and law firms, do not let diversity fatigue be an excuse for doing more. And I always tell people, I'm not a marathon runner. I think I've done a 5K a few times. But when marathon runners hit mile 19, they are fatigued. They don't quit running. They figure out what they need to do to finish the race. And I am a competitive tennis player. I didn't say good, but I am competitive. And as the older I get tired. I get fatigued. But I don't quit and put my racket away and go have a drink. I figure out what is the energy that I need to finish the match. And by the way, a third level of fatigue is this is the 3rd time I'm giving a presentation today. I'm a little tired, but it is my job to give you the same amount of energy on the subject that I did at 9 a.m. this morning for Northwestern Mutual. So we cannot let fatigue be an excuse. Then COVID-19 hits in March of this year. I was in Disney World with my family. We were there the week everything blew up and got home 2 days before Disney closed, and I don't think I've been on a plane since. I've been out of the house a few times. And the major fear many of us had in the D&I arena, and I know Nia knows this, is that we were scared to death that corporations and legal groups and everybody in our society was going to make the same mistakes we made after the Great Recession in 2010, where we took our eye off the prize. And from a metric perspective, we went backwards for 9 or 10 years. And coincidentally, in the legal profession, it was only in 2019 where we started to exceed some of the metrics that existed in 2009, and then COVID-19 hit. So I'm getting to law firms and corporations saying, do not take your eye off the D&I prize. The best corporations and the best law firms focus on this subject equally, if not more, during bad economic times as they do good. And then in the end of May, something happened, the George Floyd murder. And what was interesting to me watching this is the George Floyd murder isn't new. It happened 2 weeks before. It happened 2 months before. It happened 5 years ago. It's happened for 400 years. And by the way, it's happened since. But for some reason, many feel that we've hit a Malcolm Gladwell tipping point and that this time is different. Now, I'm not a Pollyanna, but I am an optimist, and I sense some things that are different. An example, the presentation that I give to corporate legal groups, I'm averaging 3 to 5 times a week when I was averaging 1 to 2 times a month before June. I have CEOs of Fortune 500 corporations telling their general counsels to reach out to me and let me help them with minority women-owned law firms, but D&I in a broader area. I have the privilege of speaking to you today, which is a different audience. I am also hearing white males say things I've never heard them say before. I am privileged, right? I mean, people are uncomfortable with the concept of privilege. It's something you shouldn't brag about, but not be ashamed of. It's things that you have that you were born with. And by understanding privilege, you understand the importance of allowing people to be at the same level of footing than you are. In addition, I am hearing white CEOs say all lives matter. All lives can't matter until Black lives matter. And that is amazing. And finally, I am hearing people talk about the need for systemic and institutional change in our corporate world and in the legal arena. And that is new. So I am hoping that we have now hit a constant versus the waves we've had in diversity inclusion in the corporate world. Sierra, next slide, please. So this is the agenda for today. I love mantras, and my major admonition to all of you is it's time to stop admiring our problems and start solving. And a little hint, it's not binary whether you look at the things that others are doing but put more persistence and priority around them versus being more innovative. It's both. There are some excellent practices that corporations are doing that we need to emulate. But there are also some amazing innovative things that corporations are doing that we need to copy as well. It's the combination. I will share relatively briefly my self-deprecating journey through unconscious bias because I think it's a huge issue for all of us. Hopefully, most important for you, I will give you at least my structure for building a best-in-class corporate diversity inclusion program. And I say it from two vantage points. Number one, when I spent most of my career at Accenture, I was tasked with developing a best-in-class D&I program for a global legal group. And number two is I get to see what other corporations are doing in this area. And I've come to some conclusions on what programs are likely to fail versus what programs are likely to thrive. I am probably only going to spend a minute or two on NAMWOLF, but I will let you know these slides are available to you. And if you want to hear more and bring it back to your legal groups, please let me know. And then hopefully we'll take some questions for the end of the session. Next slide, please. So, you know, why do we care, right? I mean, it's a question some people ask, some people don't, but they're feeling it. I mean, we care because there are going to be more people in 2044 in America that don't look like me than look like me. That's incredible. There are going to be more minorities than majorities in our country. And by the way, most of our corporations are very heterogeneous, but they need to be more heterogeneous to be able to better serve the consumer base as well as the employee base that they're serving. This is a critical issue that we need to be cognizant of. Next slide, please. Normally, when I have a little bit more time, I tell you to read the slide and then I'll distill it. I'm going to go reverse. I'm going to distill this for you. But this is another, what I like to provide takeaways for you to think about. I fell in love with diversity inclusion as a first-year lawyer at Allstate Insurance Company in 1984 because I was 100% sold on the moral case. But I wasn't that successful convincing a lot of other people to follow suit because they needed to be told it was the smart thing to do. In the early 2000s, in corporations, you started to see people showing the analytics of diversity. It's the smart thing to do. We'll be richer for it. And then what happened is a cottage industry sprung up a few years later, basically saying, well, those analytics aren't right. That data is not correct. This is an apples to oranges comparison and not an apples to apples. And what I love about this slide, and it's a quote from David Wilkins, who's a professor at Harvard, if you want to persuade people to change the world in which we live in with respect to diversity and inclusion, you need to sell them on both. We have normative reasons to do more as people and in our corporations. And number two, if you do this, you will achieve greater financial results. It's when you argue both that you will be successful. When you argue one versus the other, you may not be. Next slide, please. So you can go one more, Sierra. But a couple years ago, I went on the internet and I just looked up metrics for diversity inclusion. And what's interesting about this slide, the numbers here are a little bit old. Most recently, McKinsey came out with a report that shows almost the same exact analytics, but with greater numbers to do diversity. But what's important for you to understand, for those of you that need to be sold both on the smart versus the right thing to do, let's talk about money and why corporations should be taking this as a significant priority. Corporations that have better D&I programs than their competition have better financial returns. They make more revenue. They have more net income. They have higher cash flow. They have greater customer wins. They have higher market share. They come to more innovative decisions. They're more change ready. And for my friends in law firms that need to be sold on the business case, if you're a partner at a law firm, and I can tell you you'll make at least $100,000 more per equity partner if you figure this out more than your competition. Now, I just saw an analytic a month ago that had $280,000 per equity partner for the largest law firms. There are so many business metrics that show that corporations are using diversity and inclusion as a competitive differentiator. In addition, what you don't see here is probably one of the most important metrics for those of you who lead teams or manage people: engagement. When I was at Accenture, we measured engagement. Engagement can be distilled easily into, do you say the right things? Do you strive to do your best every day? And do you plan on staying in your company longer than 5 years? And the reason engagement is so important is studies have shown that the higher the engagement, the more productive your group will be. You will have less unmanaged attrition. People will want to stay, and you will attract even greater talent. And in 2005, I had responsibility for the global engagement of the legal group at Accenture, but I specifically had built a D&I legal program the year before. In 2005, in the United States, our engagement score skyrocketed. And I'm patting myself on the back and saying they got the best boss in the world. This place is easy to work. We pay our people way too much money. I had created a work from home policy part-time way back in the early 2000s, so people love that. Now, hopefully some of that was true. Maybe they liked their boss a little bit. But when we peel the onion back and tried to figure out why our engagement score skyrocketed, it was because we had stood up a D&I program that was considered best in class and others wanted to follow. And we were able to have the lowest unmanaged attrition in the United States we ever had. And we were attracting greater talent than we ever had. So what I would tell you to transfer that to the corporate world, if you figure this out better than others, your engagement scores will improve significantly. And talent is such an important piece of Lambert and the other companies that are represented here and most of the law firms that I talk to. If we can attract better talent and retain our best talent, that is a critical differentiator to doing well. Next slide, please. So before I set up the foundation of what a best-in-class program looks like, I need to call this out. And by the way, I do want to have a disclaimer. I am not going to talk about conscious bias. I'm not going to talk about bigots and racists and misogynists and others that don't want to change, that know their biases, and that either are proud of them or too stubborn to change. But I do want to talk about unconscious bias. I think it is the number one impediment to us as corporations to move the ball through the goal line. And the reason I say that, and you can turn to the next slide, is because many of us refuse to acknowledge we have unconscious biases. I am ashamed to say that I was 55 years old before I finally understood that I had biases that I wasn't aware of, that my brain was reaching conclusions without telling me. I took the Harvard implicit bias when I was 55 to confirm that I, Joel Stern, lawyer, D&I zealot, self-aware, educated, aware of my strengths, aware of my weaknesses, have no biases, right? Because I'm taking a D&I job 24/7. So I take the Harvard implicit bias test. And there's different tests. There's gender, there's race, there's ethnicity, there's sexual orientation, there's religion, there's perceived beauty versus unattractiveness. And I had a moderate bias. And I was ready to write Harvard a note saying your academic institution has gone downhill, right? Because you're showing me that I have biases. I don't have biases. I know me. But I waited and I took the test again in 6 months and I had the same exact bias in the same exact test. So then I took it a third time 6 months later and I jimmied the system to answer the questions that they wanted me to answer the way they wanted me to answer. And I had the same exact biases. It took me 2 years to acknowledge that I had things going on in my head that I had no clue. And I wish that I knew that when I was 20 years old. I would have been such a better leader. And the point of this story is, if you acknowledge the fact that we all have biases that we're not aware of, and you then figure out what those biases are, you're going to be so much better positioned to move the needle with respect to D&I. And let me give you an example of that. I spent a lot of time talking to law firms about the importance of diversity and inclusion. Before I took this test, I would look at the audience, like I'm looking at you today virtually, and I'd make an assumption. And I would say 25% of that audience, no matter how many times I put my foot in my mouth, no matter how fatigued I am, no matter how ineffectual I am, no matter how uninspiring I am, they're going to walk out of that room, going to Jeff and others and say, we got to do more. This is fantastic. What are we going to do tomorrow? Because they were excited about the subject when they walked in. I ignored them. And then I looked at 50% of the audience and I made an assumption. I said, wow, if I'm really good and I'm on my game and I inspire them and galvanize them to action, then maybe they're going to walk out of that room and going back to leadership and saying, here's the things we need to do. And I ignored them. I spent the entire 45 minutes on that 20 to 25% that had their BlackBerries on, so I'm dating myself, that had no desire to be in that room, that were bored, that only wanted to talk about money, 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 that either had bias or unconscious biases. Because I'm competitive, I spent my entire time focused on that group, and I was so unsuccessful. But by taking unconscious bias training, what I realized, and the reason it was such an epiphany for me and cathartic, is if I only focused on that 50%, people that wanted to do the right thing, that thought they were doing the right thing, but weren't because of biases in their head, I would have been so much more successful. So ever since I've taken implicit bias training, I now focus on those that have these biases that they're not aware of. Next slide. You know, people who minimize unconscious bias, these are simple numbers. I mean, if 75% of the people that take this test prefer white people over minorities, and 45% of Black people also favor white people over people of color, white people over people of color, that is a significant problem. How do we move if we have these biases that are adversely impacting minorities and people of color, and even more specifically, African Americans? And there are differences depending on your race and ethnicity. If you're a female African American lawyer in our profession, you have a unique set of challenges that are much more difficult than other minority status. Next slide, please. So unconscious bias, to do it right, is not an hour presentation, surely not 10 or 15 minutes. It really is continuous, and there's so many great experts out there I'll talk about in a second. But I want to share with you two biases that for my entire tenure of managing large teams, I had no idea that I had. First was the halo effect. And I'm talking to a lot of people in Michigan, so we'll start with the University of Michigan. I interviewed all the people that worked in the Accenture legal group in the Americas, for the most part. And when I met with them and their son played football at the University of Michigan, or their daughter played lacrosse at Michigan State, so I think I balanced both schools, I spent the next 45 minutes excited, talking sports, talking about Cleveland Browns, talking about Cleveland Indians to a lesser extent, hearing about your son and all the accolades that he has gotten, or your daughter. And I was much more likely to recommend that person to be hired. But God forbid that person came in with a love of Shakespeare or pottery or Renaissance art. And even though they were passionate, which is something so important for any job, that I got turned off and bored, I was more likely to not suggest that that person be engaged at Accenture. Now, I'm embellishing a little bit. It wasn't that black and white, but I clearly had an affinity for people that love sports. And I was much more likely not to get into, will they be happy? And will we be happy with them? The other one I suffered from was the fundamental attribution error. And this one paradoxically benefited women over men, but I'm still disgusted with myself for not knowing I did this. If a male and a female came in with the exact same resume and there was a gap in their resume with respect to jobs, if you were the female, I subconsciously presumed you just had a baby, you're taking care of your sick aunt, you're doing something greater than the practice of law. Any other positive excuse, I attributed something that was fallacious. But if the guy came in with the same exact resume, it's, when did you get out of jail? Why can't you hold a job? What's wrong with you? And I was much more likely to suggest the woman be hired than the male. Now, the last bias on this slide is not one I suffered from, but it's one that I would call out to all of you as you try to increase the diversity of your group or the diversity within the companies and tier 2 suppliers that you're using, the incumbency bias. If we're not careful, as we try to increase diversity in our organizations, we are going to judge the minority to the incumbent who knows you, who knows how you like to be billed, who knows where you like to go to lunch, who knows whether you want them to polish pebbles with their work or not, or just get it to you. And the new person who's increasingly diverse, if we're doing our job right, knows none of that. We don't acclimate them to our culture. And if we're not careful, we're going to like the incumbent more than the new person, and we're going to subconsciously attribute that to they're Black, they're Latinx, they're gay, they're females. We need to be understanding that it's not because of their minority status that they're not up to the incumbency level. It's we don't like change, this is hard. We've got to spend the time acclimating new people, increasingly diverse talent, to our cultures to make this right. Next slide, please. People want to minimize unconscious bias. I will tell you it impacts every single thing we do. Who we hire, I've already explained what I did wrong, who we promote, who we fire, mentoring, the overall engagement of the group. It impacts our desire to be inclusive. And by the way, diversity without inclusion does not solve. The metrics are only one piece of the puzzle. It's how do you embrace the diversity you have? How do you make them feel part of your organization? A lot harder than the metrics. It impacts the big providers we reach out to and who we like and who we don't like and who we find flaws in. In the legal realm, there's been study after study after study that shows that the partner that's grading the associate's paper will grade a women and or minority much harsher than the white male. Before I took unconscious bias training, I would attribute that to bigotry, racism, or whatever. Today, I know the small group of people had that, but for the most part, there is an unconscious bias that the person believes that the white male is a better writer than the minority or the woman and minority. And it clearly impacts who we use in the tier 2 level when we use minority and women-owned businesses. Because again, without knowing the incumbency biases and others, we're going to grade them more harshly. Next slide, please. So what do we do before we move into what a best-in-class corporate D&I program looks like? Number one, we need to understand the biases we have. Take the Harvard implicit bias training. What I've seen is some companies have their groups, take them as a group and have a third-party independent person grade it anonymously and show the scores. Where does the HR group fit with respect to the biases that they have? Where does the procurement group sit? Where does the legal group sit? It's an amazing exercise. Understand that when you know your biases, I personally don't believe you'll ever be cured of them. Unfortunately, I compare it to a drug or alcohol addiction. You can take steps to minimize them. For example, whenever I interview people and they love sports, I spend no more than 5 minutes on sports. And when they love pottery, I make sure I'm watching their passion, because if they're passionate about pottery, they're going to be passionate about working with me. And I look at that as a plus, not a negative. Stay on top of your biases. It's easy to share with your best friends what your biases are, and they'll tell you how great you are. It's much harder to share those same biases with your bosses or your mentors or with others that are going to be critical of the bias that you have and the steps you're taking, are going to honestly grade you. And then bring experts in. There's so many amazing experts in the field. I mean, Michelle Silverthorne is an expert in the legal field. She's CEO of Inclusion Nation, but there's so many experts in the corporate arena that go out and train their legal groups. And I've never heard of, and corporate groups, and I've never heard a corporate group say that they didn't get their money's worth out of this training. Next slide, please. So we're now moving on to how to build a corporate best-in-class D&I program. And Sierra, you can move to the next slide, and we're going to park it there for a while. So what I want to be careful about is my goal is not to have you take a whole bunch of notes and say, we're going to do everything Joel says. My goal is to have you think about this hopefully in a different way, or maybe consistent with what you're doing, and to take away, glean some things that you're going to do differently to build up or enhance the program that you have. Before we talk about what a best-in-class corporate program looks like, we need to talk about the things on the left-hand side. These are the things that I'm absolutely convinced if a corporation is not willing to do, your program has a very high degree of failing. On the contrary, if your corporation does these things on the left-hand side, I believe your program has a great likelihood of attaining the goals that you set. So it's easy to say you need top-down support, and I very rarely see a corporation be able to do what they want when they don't have the most senior leadership people saying we support this. But what may or may not be a surprise to you is the best programs that I've seen, both the corporate and the legal sides. It's not the CEO or the executive vice president or the general counsel that's driving the program. It's a 6 to 10-year employee that is passionate about this, that has this amazing talent to drive enthusiasm up and down. So I always say you need top down and bottoms up and everything in between support. The best corporations have a mission and vision statement, and we'll talk about this when I do a diagnostics of your corporation to talk about the program. They have that mission and vision statement. They share it within their company. They share it with their constituents. They share it with their customers. They put it on their website. They share it with their providers. They share it with their law firms. People are accountable for having that program work. It needs to be embedded in your core values. It needs to be baked into your DNA, or it will not work. We've seen what happens with corporations. When economic times are bad, they deprioritize it because it wasn't part of their core. And if you don't bake it into your core values, it will be perceived as philanthropy, a nice to have, a check the box. The board is forcing us to do it. It will not achieve the results that you want. And by the way, I can tell you this, and I've heard it time and time again, better to say nothing to your employees and do nothing than to say something about this and do very little. It needs to be managed as a strategic imperative. And what that means is look at all the critical programs that Lambert and the others that are watching this have, whatever they are. There's probably 3 to 5, maybe more, maybe less, that are critical strategic imperatives that you are focused on to take your company to the next level. If diversity and inclusion isn't one of those and isn't treated equally with respect to those other programs, it will fail. It will not stand up during bad times. The best corporations treat this like they would any other strategic program. And that means a lot of project and program processes, rigorous processes around their program. I am very Pavlovian, so I believe in both carrots and sticks. You need to reward the behavior you want, and you need to punish the behavior you don't want. The best corporate D&I programs have accountability for everybody, from the CEO down to that first-year analyst or first-year salesperson. Every single person needs to have a D&I metric. And by the way, if they meet it or exceed it, they should be rewarded. And if they don't, there should be an impact. Because if you're not willing to do that, strong likelihood that your program is not going to work. And with respect to that, you need to create goals that are measured, that are concrete, that are sustainable. And you need to take those goals and you need to basically put them into people's performance metrics. And when people achieve those goals, you need to set the bar higher. The other comment I would make here is you need to have successes and failures communicated. You need to go after the awards. I always tell people that in my lifetime of fighting for D&I, we won lots of awards at Accenture and in other positions I held. And I won't lie to you, there was an intrinsic ego value to winning those awards. I felt good, right? I'm not going to deny that. You will feel good. But much more importantly, when you win these awards at the corporate level, the very next question the CEO is going to ask you, because I've seen it time in, time out, is what are we going to do to raise the bar higher? How are we going to take this to the next level? And you should have failures, because if you don't have failures, it means you're not being innovative. You're not stretching yourself. Failures aren't bad. Learn from others, but you can also be so much better when you have those failures and not repeat those same mistakes. And then finally, we lead versus follows. And I can give this to you from the legal perspective, but it would be true of any department you work at. When I was at Accenture, every year in the annual report, there was at least one paragraph where legal was prominently mentioned. And the paragraph may have had a different litigation or a different Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, name your bad thing that's going to hit the company. But the paragraph was always, if this goes south, this could have a material detrimental impact on the share price of Accenture. And then that same year, 1 year, and I remember it like it was yesterday, there was another paragraph that mentioned legal. And it was a paragraph that said, look what the North America Legal Group is doing in the diversity inclusion space. We're really proud of them. They have done something that nobody else has done. And when your group, whatever department you're in at your corporation, can be a leader and not a follower, whether you're HR or procurement or whatever. And you can get others both in your organization and outside to emulate what you're doing. It is an incredible feeling. So those are the things that I would suggest you on the left-hand side that are critically important to any best-in-class program. Now we're going to talk about the right-hand side, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently. If I was meeting with you separately and you asked me to give you a perspective of your program, the very first thing I would do is a diagnostics. I'd want to understand where you are with respect to your program, whether you're in your embryonic stages of forming it, or whether you have a mature program that you're proud about, and I would be assessing you with respect to that. So what I would be doing is I'd be asking you a series of questions. Number one, internal focus. I would basically say, do you have a D&I program in place? If so, who is on the committee? Is it diverse? Is it inclusive? When I go to law firms and I meet with their D&I groups and everybody is 35 and under and of minority status and or female, that's a problem. In order to solve, you need inclusion. I love affinity groups. I love ERG groups. They are critically important to what we do in raising these issues to the right level. But if we don't have inclusion, if you don't have the majority in the room rolling his sleeves up, getting involved, trying to change the world in which we live in, your program will not solve. And that is sometimes hard to hear. But it's a critically important message, and I say it from years of experience. Your D&I focused must be inclusive. There must be people at the senior levels that are white males that are part of trying to change the world, or it will not work. Do you have a mission and vision statement? Is it on your website? Who have you communicated it with? Do you share it with your employees, your board, your clients, your suppliers? Does your program cover all 4 areas? Do you have concrete goals in place as a program? And are you rewarding the behavior that you want to see and punishing the behavior that you don't? Do your employees, including the CEO, have performance metrics, and is their compensation to some extent tied to the progress on D&I? Do you measure diversity at all levels? I'm so used to corporations telling me we're 50% female and we're 23% minority. I go, that's great. But what does it look like as people move up? What we know in the legal profession, which by the way is dead last with respect to the hiring of minorities and women, that they start off at numbers that represent the law school graduations, but as they move up the ladder, the percentages decrease. Women are 50% of law school graduates for years, and they're only 20% of equity partners. That's a problem. It's worse for minorities, and it's true for other pieces of the corporation. So you've got to ask the right questions, not only what our metrics are, but what do we look like at all levels so we can figure out what the solution is, which, by the way, may be different gender versus minority. And even within minority, you may have a different set of challenges for African Americans versus Hispanic or Asian Americans or openly LGBT. You've got to peel back that onion, use the data, and then figure out a plan to make things better. What is your unmanaged attrition? I'd love to hear a law firm tell me that's the same for the white male as it is for minorities and women. It's not true. For most corporations and law firms, you're losing minority and women top talent at 10x the white male. It's important to have that data. Do you have affinity groups in place? How is that going? What are they doing to roll up their ideas into that D&I inclusive group to actually take steps to solve? What is the composition of your D&I team? We talked about that before. Are you bringing in experts to periodically help you? From a board composition and C-suite composition, what's the composition of your board and C-suite? And by the way, this does not change overnight. But once you understand what you have, you can then figure out where do you want to be, and then you can figure out how you want to get it. And it's slow changing board composition, right? I know a lot of companies that will brag like crazy about the gender diversity they have on their board. Very few can tell you that they have that same level of diversity for minorities and specifically African Americans, and that's okay. But identify it as a problem, turn it into a challenge and an opportunity, and what are you going to do to solve it? What are you doing with respect to bringing in the talent? Are you looking at the same place over and over again? Or are you expanding the pipeline to look for talent? You know, in the law school arena, law firm arena, you know, we have the same law firms looking at the same top 10 law schools in the United States, and then they'll tell you they can't find Black talent. And I say, open up your eyes. On the corporate side, we need to expand the places we're looking for the incredible talent we're trying to find. And by the way, if those people didn't go to the top level school or have the same resume as other people you're looking at, I would suggest to you also have to look at the mountains that many of these people had to climb that I've never even seen in a lifetime, and the passion they have for whatever position that you're looking for. You've got to make that part of the equation. Are you doing internships with schools? And what schools are you doing internships with? Has your team undergone unconscious bias? If not, you really need to. Are you using your HR group to look at the hiring and promotion processes that you have in place? Because we know there's a lot of implicit bias in the hiring criteria and the promotion criteria. And unless we have the experts, including those in HR, look at those documents and get rid of the implicit biases that are in there, we're going to perpetually make it more difficult for minorities and women to be hired and to move up. Are you going for awards? Are you a leader and not a follower? On the inclusion side, what are you doing to create a more inclusive group? Do you have mentoring programs in place? Are you doing cross-mentoring? Some of the most coolest programs I've seen is where corporations mentor with some of their biggest suppliers and vice versa. It works really well. What's your leadership culture? You know, there are 4 best practices that corporations do when they're serious about diversity and inclusion. Number 1, they establish a sense of belonging for everyone. Number 2, they practice empathetic leadership. And by the way, lawyers are worst at it because we were never trained to be empathetic. We were never trained to listen. As you listen to me talk, what do? I talk. We need to be better listeners. We need to acknowledge that top-down isn't enough. And we also have to understand that quotas don't automatically create inclusion. That's a critical component. Too many companies are talking about their metrics and stopping. So that's internal focused. On the procurement side, most of you are purchasing goods and services from large providers every day. Have you informed those suppliers that diversity is important to you and that you want to see more diverse talent the suppliers provide to you? Are you using a carrots and sticks approach with those big providers, whether they're IBM or Microsoft or consultants like Accenture? Are you telling them that you give us more diverse talent, we're going to give you more business, and if you're not, we're going to take business away? In your RFP process and or reverse auctions, are you adding diversity and inclusion questions? On the legal side, more and more corporations are demanding that the law firms that respond to a series of D&I questions, and that is a significant piece of the criteria to ascertain whether or not you're going to do business with them. This translates very well with the procurement diversity that you're looking for in the non-law firm space. Do you have technology that allows you to understand who is doing what for you? Are you going to WeBank, which certifies women-owned companies, the NMSDC, which certifies minority-owned companies, and the NGLCC, the National Gay Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, that certifies openly LGBTQ-owned companies? Are you familiar with them? Do you go to their meetings? Do you visit the companies that are doing more in this space? The third area is pipeline diversity, and I could spend hours on this, but I can't obviously today. Personal opinion, I think the pipeline diversity is the only panacea that what ails this society and the corporations, but it takes a lot of patience. It takes planting seeds that you hope turn into beautiful flowers. And by the way, the best corporations in this area have pipeline diversity programs, not only from the young and more junior people that work in their companies, but they have them at the college level, the high school level, and even 5th, 6th, and 7th grade. Some of the best pipeline diversity initiatives I've ever been involved in we're working with 6th and 7th and 8th graders in downtown Chicago and getting them excited about being a lawyer someday. But it's critically important to have a pipeline strategy program. And if you're a smaller company, you don't have the time or the dollars or whatever to build a great pipeline program, ask your suppliers. If you have legal services, ask your law firms. There's so many ways you can partner with others to do more in the pipeline space. But I really think that's an underutilized and underemphasized piece of what a best-in-class D&I corporate program looks like. And then the final area is supplier diversity. So most companies that I deal with have highly touted supplier diversity initiatives. And these are premised on the notion that minorities and women have been economically, historically disadvantaged. And when they leave IBM or Microsoft or other large corporations and start their own businesses, and they're truly minority, women, LGBT, veteran, disabled owned, that we as a corporate society, it's incumbent upon us to give them an opportunity to showcase that talent and give them the opportunity to win the business. Most corporations that I deal with have supplier diversity programs that are loud and clear on their websites because most buyers of their products and services want to see the corporations do the right thing. So if you don't have a program, get a program. If you're not reaching out to minority and women and LGBTQ-owned businesses, start doing that. In the 5 minutes I have remaining, I just want to share a little bit about NAMWOLF because we are the answer to the question, and Sierra, you can turn the next slide. How do corporations and legal groups in those corporations take supplier diversity and bring it into the legal area? And NAMWOLF is the answer to the question, how do I get an amazing level of quality and value that also supports our company's supplier diversity initiatives? And I'm going to go through these slides very quickly. We are a nonprofit trade association of minority and women-owned law firms. We believe an incredible way to increase diversity in our profession is to get companies to increase the utilization of minority and women-owned law firms. Next slide, please. This is our mission. This is a mission that has been spread to some of the most amazing corporations across the United States. Our law firms practice in several different areas, including litigation, labor employment, IP, M&A, bankruptcy, immigration, insurance, and corporate law, just to name a few. Next slide, please. We make it very easy for corporations to find law firms, so many different ways, but this is why corporations should think about hiring law firms. And again, this is transferable to other tier 2 suppliers that are minority women owned. These are people that not only survived at big companies or big law firms, but they thrived. They went off on their own. Great geographic footprint, have over 3,000 attorneys. We do work in most practice areas. And finally, again, we align with your corporate supplier diversity initiatives or your corporate supplier diversity philosophy if you don't have a specific initiative. Next slide, please. Law firms that get into NAMWOLF have to go through a very onerous vetting process. Long story short, Fortune 500 companies have to let us know. They provide 3 references, and those references basically say, I've used this law firm, I love this law firm, and I recommend that my brethren at Lambert Legal use this law firm. It's a pretty tough standard, and they're all truly certified by the NMSDC, WeBank, or NGLCC. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and I share this with you because it's the slide that's probably the most important slide in this deck, at least as it relates to me. For my entire career, I've been passionate about diversity and inclusion, starting with gender, when I saw the inequality that women went through when I worked with lots of women in the legal group, and then it evolved to minorities, and then most recently, the LGBTQ community. I thought I said the right thing for the most part. I thought I did the right things. I thought I wrote the right checks, but the world wasn't changing. And in 2014, I was gainfully employed and having a lot of fun. NAMWOLF called, knocked on the door. I fell in love with the organization back in the early 2000s when I brought him into Accenture, and they asked me to take this job. And coincidentally, I had just seen this quote that I attribute to Mahatma Gandhi, and it really changed the way that I look at everything. It's that in the legal profession, I would suggest to you the same is true at the corporate level. The world is not changing because we're not becoming the change. We look at this for 5 minutes every week, 10 minutes every day, whatever it is. To really change the corporate landscape and make the systemic and institutional changes that we need to make, we have to become the change. And I'm not suggesting that anybody that's listening in quits their job and does what I do. That's crazy, right? But what I am suggesting is that if you really believe in the subject, you need to take this message, whatever you learn and whatever that you will learn in the D&I arena, and bring it back to your corporation and get them sold on the need to create a program like they do any other program, and not only have it run, but run very well. The other point I would make is after the George Floyd murder occurred in June, we caught that wave, as I alluded to before, but I decided, with respect to become the change you wish to see in the world, to do some things differently after that. And I wrote some things down that I'll end with to force myself to become the change. Number one, I am never silent again when I observe behavior that is not acceptable. And I will never suffer or allow people to suffer being held to microaggressions that occur each and every day. I donate to causes that are fighting racial injustice. I better educate myself on what being Black in America is about and supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. I reach out to African American law students and offer to mentor them, and I'm helping several of them. I reach out to my African American friends and listen to their stories. My mom said, you were born with 2 ears and 1 mouth. You should listen twice as much. I have violated that rule since the day I came out of the womb. But I'm really focusing on listening to the stories and trying to understand what it's like to be Black in America. I'm really working hard to get people to understand their biases and take steps to minimize them. I am supporting affinity organizations and their fight for equality. I am creating a culture of inclusion wherever I can. And then finally, I am never going to give up on the fight and allow diversity fatigue to be an excuse for not doing more. So my time is up. Thank you, Sierra, Jeff, Nia.
Hey, thanks, Joel, and really appreciate that. I knew that you would be a gift to our clients and team members and partners, and it was such a gift to me. And so thank you for sharing. Thank you for being inspiring and impactful and challenging us. But it makes me think about such great content. Nia, you're on the front lines of a lot of this, and in these boardrooms where executives are saying, okay, we need to change. Can you help us? Are people changing? What's happening? Is there momentum? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think, 5 months ago, as we were saying, the world witnessed the murder of George Floyd, and people were horrified. I mean, I was traumatized. And there were a lot of immediate acts, and now we're moving into the next phase of really needing long-term action. There are a lot of companies that posted a black square on their Instagram grid as a show of solidarity, and you could read into that what you want. But now comes the harder work of looking inward and looking into our systems. We know that racism is systemic, and so we have a responsibility to do that, to look at and evaluate our systems, our processes, our operations. I was just thinking about the 1619 project that the New York Times did, and they said that we're 154 years away from the end of slavery, but 4 centuries away from the start, right? So we're in the middle of it. And I think that's what leaders are really contending with, this idea that we're in the middle of issues that we have to solve, and we're going to make some headway, but really it's, to Joel's lasting point, it's thinking about the kind of world that we want to live in and exist in and leave for future generations. And I think that in the experience that we're having at EQUALSIGN, a lot of leaders are really thinking about it, in that respect. And so when we think about that, we have to start to look at where we are so that we can determine where we want to go as we build those strategies. And we have to do uncomfortable things like look at the state of our organizations, look at the data. I love looking at data because oftentimes it tells us stories of where we are, but also maybe why we are where we are. And although I think this can feel like very confronting work to leaders, although it's incredibly important, what we also find is that some of the greatest gains that we can have in diversity, initiatives and in creating cultures of inclusivity aren't even diversity-specific programs. It's bringing that lens to existing programs. So Joel was talking about the importance of recruiting. You know, I'll ask, you know, some leaders or HR executives, you know, well, are there any HBCUs that you might be recruiting from? And, you know, can you name an HBCU? You know, so there are different learning curves amongst different leaders, but I think it's what we're overwhelmingly finding is as they step into this process, it's demystified because we can start from where they are, and that's really what this work is about. If it's truly going to be sustainable within that organization, and CEOs are, you know, they're becoming courageous, and you know they have to be courageous, but their actions have to be courageous, you know, as well. And I'm just reminded of one client that, you know, the conversation that we just had is, okay, if 13.4% of America is Black, and I'm a publicly traded company, 13.4% of my workforce should be Black. So it's not today, but how do I move in that direction? What are the strategies that I can begin to employ? What kind of resources do we need to put against this being a metric that is really built into our operational trajectory over the next 10 years? So those are the types of conversations that are exciting to have. That's the type of courage that we're really starting to see, but it's coming from a very deeply rooted place of thinking about not just our business, but what is the legacy of our business. And I think that's where the best work is going to come from in this space and where the true leaders are going to emerge.
So I just want to let everyone know who's watching this, we are available for questions if you want to put them in the chat, and we'll try to address that. Something you hit on, Nia, that ties into something that Joel said, talking about this idea of attraction, bringing in a diverse talent, but then also acclimation. How do you acclimate and retain, right? So you bring folks in and then they go out the back door because they weren't acclimated. Talk about that for both of your perspectives.
So let me give you the legal profession. We talked about the incumbency bias. Walmart has a great program in place. Whenever they bring in minority women-owned law firms, they bring them in for a series of meetings to acclimate to the culture, to develop relationships, to understand the Walmart way. They call that Walmart ready. Accenture had a program whenever it was bringing in minority and women suppliers, including law firms. It created a program that helped them indoctrinate themselves. The other thing in the law firm sphere, we talk about client relationship partners. That are the law firm lawyers at senior levels that are responsible for the client. We need to have a law firm relationship partner. We have to have a business relationship partner. When we're bringing in more diverse talent as a supplier, we need to take the time to acclimate them to the culture. The other thing, and I have a daughter in talent management, we have historically spent so much time on acquiring the talent and so little time on retaining the talent. Mm-hmm. Companies that spend the same amount of time on promoting the talent they have and retaining the talent are the ones that are figuring out. There needs to be a very concrete strategy on how you're going to keep the talent that you have. And today, there isn't a lot. Nia, I'm interested in your opinion as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that some of what we've seen, especially in smaller companies, and what Walmart's a very big one, is the lack of development of that middle management layer, regardless of any sort of element or component of diversity. And so what we have found is that if you are recruiting new team members into your organization, but you also don't have the infrastructure to support the career trajectory of that person or any, people really internally in your organization, that is an operational and programmatic kind of hole in the organization that is certainly not serving the individuals in your organization that may not represent, the majority. And I think what we also have to think about is it can be a very lonely and isolating experience to not feel as though you're being mentored. And what we've also found is that, the data shows that women of color especially, are the ones that take advantage of mentorship programs more than any other demographic, and have thus become more successful as a result of them as well. So I think we have to make sure that we're continuing to strengthen these opportunities for mentorship, for engagement, for cross-divisional work in task force that might allow greater opportunities to learn about the business, but also interface with other people from around the company. So I love when you mentioned, employee resource groups and affinity groups. Those things are important. But also in my time at Viacom, a lot of the cross-divisional work that we were doing, even if it was ESG or pro-social in nature, and people were volunteering for it, it was also providing them an access and an opportunity to learn about different parts of the business. So to the extent that diversity, inclusion, to the extent that employees that might be underrepresented in the organization are also having the opportunity to accelerate their growth trajectories and careers in these ways in which we know are supportive, statistically speaking, to underrepresented individuals. I think that's just better for the business, but we also know that they will excel from those opportunities and not feel isolated within the organization.
And just piling on to your excellent response, I was on a woman-wide network meeting or podcast yesterday, and we talked about the need to stand up each other. Women and minorities need to stand each other up. And the other thing is women and minorities and other groups that are successful in time management, in leadership, in working from home, and having a child and working, they need to create teachable point of views and share it, because leadership is all about leaders teaching other leaders. So one of the takeaways that I'd ask you to think about is, if you have a story to tell, you're good at something, create a teachable point of view, a slide deck, and share it with others to help bring other people up.
Mm-hmm. Yes, certainly. And the other thing that I would add is also making sure that within organizations, there are dedicated human resources and also financial resources to support these efforts as well. Because one misstep that we can also see happen sometimes is the idea that the people of color within an organization, who certainly may have a perspective to share, but are also asked to do so, and it feels to them as free labor as well, right? So that's also, we have to figure out how we can navigate between making sure that we're sharing best practices and that the environments feel inclusive and supportive, and making sure that the onus doesn't only fall on people of color, which is why it's so great to have the both of you in this conversation. And in the work that we do, I mean, it's white males that are leading these organizations that are putting resources towards them. I mean, 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs are Black. They're like 33 women. So, the rest are white males, frankly. And so it also relies on them as leaders of this organization to make sure that their organization has the right, again, human resources, but also financial resources to put against these programming and strategies, so that the burden also doesn't fall on at those that they would intend to be sort of the recipients of this programming, but in fact, those individuals can participate authentically in the way in which they're most comfortable.
Sorry, I fell off there for a minute. My connection went bad, but this is the wonderful thing of live TV, right? So on this idea of certainly leaders need to own this, and this predominance of white-led Fortune 500 or other businesses is a reality, as you mentioned, Nia. How do you keep this sustained? There's a moment in time here that there's been a lot of words, there's been some action, but how do you hang on to this energy, as Joel talked about, not get diversity fatigue, and then also push it throughout the organization, so you have both momentum and breadth in the need here? Maybe just talk a little bit about how do we make this more than just a 2020 phenomenon, and that this is about who we are as a society in the future.
Yeah, I think that the work ahead is great, and there's different ways in which to engage. And I even think about volunteer opportunities amongst different departments of an organization. And and one instance that I can recall is every member of the department being able to put forth an organization that was important to them in the community that the entire team would volunteer some time for. And it was an opportunity for everyone to share their perspective, to share part of themselves, to share something that was really, important to them and reflective of where their value system lies. That's an opportunity to begin a conversation, and we have to be able to have conversations at work with our, with diverse team members, with all of our team members, to be able to really sustain this type of change within an organization. I heard another friend, the retired tech community in Venice, California, and they're surfing in the morning and drinking coffee, and then they have a book club where they're reading these really, incredible, radical, free-thinking Black intellectuals from the Harlem Renaissance, and they're doing the work in their way, and it's important to do that. So book clubs. But I think what really allows people to really achieve the type of connectivity is in gaining more knowledge. And I think that the more people do that, I can see in some instances where it feels intimidating, but in many and overwhelmingly so, people lean in. I didn't understand that there was such a connection between, wealth disparity and racial disparity in the country. And it's like, well, it was always linked. That's the whole point of this, right? Like this experiment of America was fueled by a desire for money, right? And so we have to begin to understand that type of connectivity and not back away from it. But there's a reckoning that needs to happen. There's education that needs to happen. And I think that the best way is to slowly and incrementally do that work at the speed in which people are comfortable with. But organizations aren't going to have the luxury of in the way that individual citizens will. So we'll have to move our organizations at pace, but I think individually look for ways that the work, that the education does not feel so intimidating, and that there are ways to weave it into our lives, so that we can gain more knowledge and become more comfortable having these conversations.
From my perspective, it's taking that one slide and building the program around it. I met with a large healthcare company a couple of years ago and used that one slide as the basis. They had no program that couldn't spell diversity. I went back a year and a half ago. I met with different people that didn't know me from Adam, and they were proud of the program. They stood up and the accomplishments. And they shared with me a slide that was exactly my slide. They had no idea. They had no idea where it came from, and they had built a program. You need to take those pillars and do the thing. So the book club, that would be an internal thing or a pipeline thing, depending on how you put it. You create things you're going to do in those pillars. You create the accountability. You put it in the metric system. You have the top-down support. You really build it that way. I've seen it work hundreds of times in the legal area, and I've seen it work dozens of times in the corporate area. It really does work.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a question here. Have you encountered any examples of companies cultivating diverse talent pipelines, starting with outreach in college or even earlier? If so, has this approach been successful?
Well, I'll give you mine, and then Nia may have one again in the legal, because that's where I come from. Microsoft created an amazing program where they realized there was a shortage of minority intellectual property attorneys. So they went out to colleges and even some law schools and tried to get people excited that were minorities to be in patent law or copyright law, or trademark law. That's an example of going much earlier. The other example is bringing in kids at the college level, bringing them as interns. They go back, finish their school, and you're now looking to hire people, and you have that pool of talent you may not have had otherwise. Those are just two examples of how to create more diversity, but looking more strategically that I need to hire tomorrow to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and I think absolutely. It's about creating pathways for people and making sure that there's access to opportunities. I mean, what we certainly found in the time that I spent in the media spaces, there were lots of young kids, Black and brown kids, that didn't know that there were different types of jobs in the media industry that existed for them. And so we had to create internships. We had to create an opportunity for them to look behind a television show that they might see on their phones now, I guess, and understand what ad sales are, understand what network operations are, like begin to demystify some of what they see as the end product. And we had the opportunity to do that through internships, through investing in different type of fellowship programs, at local schools, MBA programs, things of that nature that create opportunities and exposure. And I think that all of those efforts, have certainly been fruitful in my experience. But it kind of goes back to what I was speaking of before, that I already know that lots of, companies engage in recruiting efforts, but where are you recruiting? So it could be that just with bringing this lens of diversity and fresh perspective to our existing processes, to our existing practices, we can start to really strengthen those pipelines because we already have the infrastructure to support that type of trajectory throughout the organization.
Well, another idea to get a takeaway, because we do in the legal area, for those of you that hire or have hiring functions, go out to historically Black college university, meet with the kids, tell them about your company, get them excited, bring them on board. That's how you drive diversity.
I think about something that we did as an organization, and it wasn't intended to have this effect. And now I look back and say, okay, we need to do this again. But we donated 10,000 books to the Flint, Michigan schools and Detroit public schools. But it wasn't the donation. It was when my partner on EQUALSIGN, Candace Bowman, went in there, read to those kids, and they stopped in their tracks and they listened to what she was talking about and said, I can be that someday. And maybe they call us and say, I want to be part of our organization someday. And so even in hindsight, listen and pay attention and say, okay, we need to lean into more of those types of things at the earliest ages.
The best pipeline story, if I have a second, because I really didn't tell it, is I was part of something called the Constitutional Rights Foundation of Chicago. We taught 6th and 7th graders in less socioeconomic status school systems. And I was teaching the class, and I had 2 Black lawyers with me that were teaching it, a Black partner on my left, a Black partner on the right. And at the end of the curriculum, there was one white young lady in the class, and she raised her hand. This is like 6 years ago. And she said, why isn't it all lives matter? And the Black partner on the left and the Black partner on the right pointing their fingers to me and said, Joel will take that one. And for 45 minutes, we had the most incredible discussion on Black Lives Matter movement. I tell the story, Gilda Spencer, good friend of mine, who, by the way, son and husband played football at Ohio State University, so obviously I like her. She tells the story about her son going to Tampa to play for the Bucs and having to travel through rural Alabama. And she said, Joel, when your 3 daughters go to Fort Lauderdale on spring break and they're driving, do you have to tell them what to do if stopped by a policeman? Oh, no, don't be crazy. Let me tell you what I had to do with Evan, right? And she shares the story. So we talked about it, and for 45 minutes, it was the best discussion I've ever had. And we think we do pipeline for the kids. We really do it for us. And what I wished for, people ask me what I dream about, I wish we had those discussions today as adults, because we're not having them. We put them under the covers. And the reality is there's a lot of liberal white males that don't understand the difference and don't understand that they're not binary. Yes, all lives matter, but here's why Black lives matter. Here's the genesis of it. Here's why it's so hard to be Black in America. So I'm telling you, from pipeline, it's 6th and 7th graders, and what you learn from it, you are a better person when you do these types of things.
Well, we're going to wrap it up with that. And I just want to thank Joel from the NAMWOLF organization. We are a member. I would encourage everyone listening to become a member, take action. Nia and EQUALSIGN, thank you for the work that you're doing in changing the trajectory of diversity in America. And to all of you listeners, I really was inspired by Joel's kind of personal mission statement. And so I'd invite all of you to make one commitment after this webinar on something you're going to do individually to make change in this world. So thank you all for joining. I really appreciate it, and see you all soon.
Thank you. Stay well.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Jeff.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
See you guys.